First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming, Your Excellencies, colleagues, and my hero, Dr. Sylvia Earle. The source of the inspiration comes from her work. I'd like to thank Matt and Mr. Crow for making this happen. This is a new presentation. In thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, I wanted to take a broader view of where we are and where we would like to go. So the title of the talk says, From Planetary Tipping Points to Economic Turning Points. So if you get bored and you want to leave, this story has a happy ending. You may want to stay. But like all happy endings, they start in a place that is not so. Okay, so turning points here is just the beginning of the story, but the story is going to demand us to think of a turning point. And together, we're going to turn this around. So where does this story start? All right, so I have the honor of being with Dr. Sylvia Earle, a member of the Planetary Guardians, and we have a very famous planetary scientist with us, Dr. Johan Rockström. And Johan always reminds us that right now we're not doing great, that due to human activity, we have breached 7 out of the 9 planetary boundaries. Now, let me clarify what he means by that. That what he's really trying to say is our actions are causing nature to be at risk. And if you had the luck to be in Sylvia's seminar yesterday, pretty much she's saying the same thing. She's saying nature is at risk. Now, when we say nature is at risk, we're not talking about dead nature because that nature is dead. It's the living nature. The living planet is at risk, and is at risk because of our activity. But when you ask Johan, where are we right now, that the chart tells you, he says, we are in the risk zone. We haven't yet entered the tipping point. The tipping point is basically the point of no return, is when nature itself says, you know what, I give up. Okay, you guys are on your own. But we're not there yet, which means we can do something about it. So this is a story of hope. Right? It's much more than that. Okay, so you listen to Johan and he says this. Now watch the next slide. I spent 25 years at the IMF as assistant director. If the IMF was here today, they will tell you, well, look, global growth is projected to remain resilient at 3.1%. Yeah? And for 27, about 3.2%. So here's a famous planetary scientist saying we're at the tipping point. We're close to point of no return. And here's the foremost macro institution in the world saying, well, growth is going to be 3.2. So if you happen to be, like me, spending 25 years in the policy space, which language are you going to tune into? Earth system, scientist work, or are you going to tune into the economics and the finance? This dissonance between the two messages is, to my mind, the source of systemic risk. Now, let me show you why the IMF is saying what they're saying. Because the economics profession looks at the world like this. I'm a professional macroeconomist, financial economist. I practiced it for 32 years. I still do. Well, we look at the world, when we look at any economy, we think, well, the economy is made up of a government sector, a household sector, a financial sector, and a production sector. Where is nature in this world? Well, nature is just an input into the output, right? Timber, minerals, gas, oil, all of that stuff, they're just inputs into the output, which were the products that we produce. And as we produce these products, we also are degrading nature, right? Pollution and all this other stuff. So this is the model that the IMF uses and every professional economist in the world uses. This is our bread and butter. So if you believe this is the reality that we are in, then everything looks good. Okay? This basically is saying, well, if you look at GDP, by the way, this is calibrated to a country, which I will not name. You look at the GDP of the country, it's like, okay, yeah, things look good, growth looks good. Debt to GDP, okay, rising a bit, but that's not really something to worry about. Sovereign ratings are not too bad, and look, the banks are making profits hand over fist. You see? So you stop listening to my colleague Johan, and you stop focusing that, why am I worried about this? Well, because the dashboard that you're looking at is masking something that is happening behind the scenes. Here's what's happening. Let's go back to that graph. Here's what we all practice as professional economists, and we only look at nature from the provisioning side, the food side, the input side. But nature is much more than this. Nature is the home where we live. That's the green part. Everything we ever do sits inside nature. Partha Dasgupta would tell you, Sir Partha Das would say, nature is our home. This is our home. But nature, the living nature does a lot more than just being a resource into the production. It regulates our climate. It provides stability to our system. It provides well-being to us. That's the living part of nature. That's the part of nature that we as economists, we as financial people, never paid any attention to because we always thought nature will always be there. So why am I worried about it? After all, Francis Bacon said a long time ago in his book, Novum Organum, we were endowed with nature with infinite commodities. And if things are infinite, that means you can cut, pollute with impunity. But once you allow nature, the living nature, to come into the system, I'm going to show you what happens to the dashboard that you just looked at. Look at this. Johan is right. Nature, the living nature, is degrading and is degrading fast. Just take a look at the IUCN list of all the species that are about to go extinct. Look at what's happening to the oceans. Look what happened to our forests. Okay? Nature is degrading very quickly, and we are, where are we right now? We are in the yellow zone, in the risk zone. We haven't yet entered, although if you talk to our other colleague in Planetary Guardian, Professor Carlos Nobre, he's the expert on the Amazon forest. He'll tell you part of the Amazon is no longer a carbon sink, it's now a carbon emitter. So some parts of nature have entered the tipping zone. But let's look at the full dashboard now. Once you allow nature to be a living system and you bring it into the economic system, this is really what's going on. All that dashboard that you looked at before is masking what's really happening behind the scenes. That's the same country, by the way. What I've added here is the tipping area, and you start to see that GDP is indeed collapsing. The growth with it. And of course, when GDP collapses, if you owe money, your debt dynamics are going to explode, and your ratings will explode, and the profits that you think you're making are not going to be there. So really being lulled into thinking that we are in good shape where we are actually not so great. Okay? So again, just to reiterate, because this has a happy ending, I'm going to show you how. Where are we right now? We're in the risk area, the area that we can make a difference. Okay? We can still go from a tipping point to a turning point. But what does it mean? A turning point towards growth and stability and prosperity. We need to turn around, okay? But in order to do that, we have to have a vision. We have to have a vision about where we want to go. Think of Alice in Wonderland, right? When she got lost. For some of us old enough to remember that story. And she bumps into the cat and tells the cat, I'm lost. Can you help me? And the cat says, well, where do you want to go? And Alice says, does anybody remember? What if I don't know? And then the cat gives her the most beautiful answer. Then she says to her, then what difference does it make? So we need to have a vision. How do we want to live for tomorrow? Well, definitely we want to bring in the living nature, because this has been really the missing part of the equation into our economics. Okay, so here's the vision. Okay? Here's a vision. We want to center our economy around the living nature. And I'll explain in detail what I'm talking about. This is not just words. Okay, so we want to go from the tipping point to a bright future, the light of a brand new day, where the living nature is part of our GDP. Okay, so what's the strategy? We want to make living nature visible. Because right now, anything we can kill or extract, we can price. But what keeps us alive, we treat as an, who would like to say it? Externality. Let me repeat. Anything you can kill, anything you can extract, you can price immediately. I practiced it for 32 years. But what keeps us alive is treated as an externality. That cannot be. Because the logical end to this is kill all living nature. And then you make some profit, and then you pay dearly for it later. So that cannot be the solution. We need to make the living nature visible. Question is, how do we do so? So here's a conversation with the excellencies in the room. Today I'm targeting sort of the government sector, which I think we've never bothered to talk to the sovereigns. I'm saying, if you really want to make a difference, you need to put nature on the balance sheet. That's basically what I'm saying here. So how do I put nature on the balance sheet? Well, we can look at nature that we have, and I'm going to give you a concrete example, okay? And if you have mangrove, seagrass, salt marsh, forests, and you're benefiting from ecotourism, you're benefiting if you want to think of carbon credits, nature credits, biodiversity credits, fees, all of these things, the asset, the underlying asset that is producing it should be on the balance sheet. All right, and then once you put it on the balance sheet and you start to monetize it, you're going to produce revenue. What this is saying is not enough to produce the revenue, because that revenue can be wasted. That revenue has to be recycled into bending the curve on the debt, for sure. But more importantly, it has to go back to look after the goose that lays the golden egg, which is the living nature. And of course, that will not actually thrive unless you look after the people that look after nature. And these are the stewards of nature. And then you have to think about inclusion. So when we do all of this, this is what I'm talking about. So we go back to the same model of what I practiced. Unfortunately, I taught my graduate students for many years when I was a professor. Okay, this is the provisioning side. That's not enough. Obviously, that is the source of the problem. Okay, we need to think of nature, the living nature, the regulating side of nature that regulates the water, regulates the climate, regulates the soil, that is responsible actually for our lives. Okay, we need to recognize that. Okay, that's the nature that's keeping the stability, and lack of it creates instability, that creates the well-being. We need to put it on the balance sheet. We need to recognize its revenues, and we need to use those revenues also to invest back in nature. Because I hear it a lot. People tell me nature is infrastructure. I'm like, dude, if nature is infrastructure, who builds an infrastructure? Governments. Who are building the highways? Who maintains the highways? So it's not enough to build the highway. You have to maintain it. You have to invest in it, right? And we also have to look at it on an individual basis. When we do that, then you get the regeneration. Then you're giving nature a chance to rebound. This is the same country. When you do all of this, notice what happens. Nature thrives. And when nature thrives, the GDP thrives, your growth thrives, okay? Your sovereign ratings will benefit, and you're going to make money. So, as one asset manager said to me, so Ralph, so goodness pays. I said, yes, Sherlock. Yes, goodness pays. Yes, yes. This is not what we were taught, which is we grow at the expense of nature. This is growing with nature. But here's something else for those of you on the finance side. Very few people know that nature is a great hedge. When you look at the volatility of nature revenues, it's the least volatile of any flows into your countries. For those of you from the island economies and others here, you're looking at flows into your country from exports, from FDI, from ODA, portfolio flows. Guess what? Nature revenues will be the least volatile because nature is a long-lived asset. It's not tied to the business cycle. It's actually, you're pulling, if you're thinking of the carbon side, you're pulling carbon from the atmosphere, and that's a stock concept. That's not a flow. So it's acyclical. And that stability of that revenue will stabilize the government finances. If you're thinking about from GDP volatility, we at the IMF, we worry a lot about GDP volatility and fiscal volatility. It actually stabilizes the flows. All right, but remember what nature is. Nature is not only a flow. I hear that a lot, and I have to correct people all the time. Nature is stock and flow. If you think of a forest, forest is a stock, but it's providing flow of services. So, which means what? Well, I'm a market economist, and I understand that markets are about pricing. Markets are very good at pricing flows, but markets are not good at protecting stock. So what we really need here is a policy stack that's really, if you want to summarize it, it's a PPP. It's a private-public partnership. Very much needed. The markets need guidance. Once you set the incentives, then markets know what to do, but the incentives have to come from the policy side. And I give you a few options to actually use here. So when we do that, guess what? I call this nature-led growth now. Which means what? Because people always tell me there's limits to growth. I said, yes, of course there's limits to growth. If I have $1 million in the bank and it's growing at 5% and I'm spending at 7%, yeah, there's limit to how happy I'm going to be. Because at 7%, I'm going to eat up the 5% and pretty much the 1 million, and then I'm going to be destitute. This is just the opposite. This says by investing in nature, nature grows at 10%, so my 7% is growing with nature, not at the expense of nature. And that limit to growth is pushed way into the future. And the future matters if we truly care about our children, our grandchildren, and the future generations. So what we're really doing here, we're actually defining a new GDP, but it comes organically. Because once you recognize nature as a new asset class, the living nature, then you're moving from a purely extractive definition of GDP, which is anything we kill, we extract, we can price, to saying, no, the living nature also has a price. So now regenerative and extractive live together happily under the same tent. And that tent is the GDP tent with the correct definition. Now let me give you a real-life example. The Bahamas, through the work of ingenious scientists, discovered that they're sitting on the largest seagrass meadow in the world. 150,000 square kilometers of seagrass, imagine. All of Spain has 16 square kilometers of seagrass, all right? Now, due to anchors from being dragged by ships, due to burn pits, due to sewage and runoff into the water, a lot of that seagrass has shrunk to about 93,000. The protection of the seagrass alone, according to the carbon market rules, can generate for the Bahamas about $13 billion. Just the carbon. But remember, when you have healthy seagrass, you have healthy fish stock. When you have healthy seagrass, you're staving off flooding. So it's much more than a carbon story. But just want to show you an example. If you were to take those 12 billion and put them on the balance sheet of the government, what would happen? Okay? So the government of Bahamas has the largest seagrass, and they've decided to use a part of the market, the carbon market, which I refer to as ITMO. Okay, it's not necessarily a voluntary carbon market. They're selling they plan to sell sovereign carbon credits, so sovereign to sovereign. Okay? Now, notice what happens. This is something I haven't shown to anybody yet. If you look at that black line, so when Hurricane Dorian hit in 2019, some people remember, it devastated the island. Okay, it put the country in debt. The debt to GDP of Bahamas is over 80%. If you look at the latest IMF report, this is what is here. That's the black line. The black line is the IMF report written with the government of Bahamas saying, well, over the next 15 years, we need to push that debt to GDP level to 20%. That's if you don't do anything. But if you were to put that 12 billion on the balance sheet of the government, and you were to monetize those credits, what I'm showing you are the next few lines, which is, yes, that is true if you do nothing, that's the black line, but just by recognizing that revenue, the asset on the balance sheet, which will change the net worth, and monetizing the revenue. And look what happens to Bahamas. It can go from a net debtor to net creditor in far fewer years. You can bend that curve in a very meaningful way. And every country here can actually do the same exercise by starting to recognize nature on their balance sheet and monetizing. You don't have to recognize all of the nature. Okay? You can recognize some of it, monetize some of it, and when you do, it's really a game changer. Imagine what you're really saying to Bahamas here, to the Minister of Finance. You're saying you're going to be a net creditor in a very few years. And all of that difference between the black line and all of these lines is the fiscal space. All of that fiscal savings can go into all the other programs that you care about, which includes looking after nature, looking after your people, creating resilience in nature, stabilizing people on their land. And that's also profits for the private sector. That's what I want to tell you. So if you stayed with me, I told you, I promised you a happy ending. And here it is. Just want to remind you that a beautiful book that my son gave me is called The Service Berry. And the author ends it by saying, all flourishing is mutual. Thank you so much.